Greetings, students. I hope you're ready for part 2 of Spinoza's Ethics, because here it comes, right? So this is the last lecture we need for week 7. That's where we are now, in week 7. And next week, we will need to cover parts 3, 4, and 5 of Spinoza's Ethics, right? And that's all of it. It has 5 parts altogether. Part 2 is called On the Nature and Origin of the Mind, and Spinoza is definitely focused on the human mind, its nature, its origin here, but we're told something about the mind of God. It's different, right? It's not the same as the human mind. Not surprisingly, I hope. Spinoza is not impressed with those who think that God has a mind like a human's mind. That's not a good compliment to God, right? Among other problems. Okay, we're going to start with part 2 in a convenient spot. We were already starting to talk about parallelism between the mental realm and the physical realm, right? And that actually is stated in part 2. So let's start with that and work backwards. So on page 391, we have proposition 7, which says the order and connection of ideas is the same as the order and connection of things. And I brought that up in the last lecture because the payoff there seems to be we have a solution, sort of, to the mind-body problem. I say it's a sort of solution because, well, we don't really get the same problem in Spinoza to begin with, right? Because the metaphysics is different. But, as I said in the last lecture, Spinoza is a Cartesian scholar, so there's a lot of Descartes that he's taking for granted. So this is going to help him solve a problem that he's concerned about from his understanding of Descartes and his readings of Descartes' texts, right? If the order and connection of ideas is the same as the order and connection of things, then the mind and body don't really have to directly interact, as I suggested in the last lecture. But let's back up, and then we'll come back to this point that they don't have to directly interact. Let's back up to proposition 3, which is at the top of page 390. That proposition states, in God there is necessarily the idea both of his essence and of all things that necessarily follow from it. Okay. So if you look at the proof for that proposition, then you understand how parallelism gets going, where it gets its footing, right? So basically what Spinoza says in the proof is all things that can exist do exist. That sounds familiar from lecture 1, right? That accounted for determinism. But it's put to a different use here. So more specifically now, all ideas that can exist do exist, right? Because God's going to express his full perfect nature, right? All possible ideas will be there, will exist, will be created. That makes it sound like a process, but from the beginning, those ideas already have been created. If there was any possibility in God's nature for their creation, they already exist. Okay. So then it follows that God has a perfect idea of his own essence. That's a possible idea. There's nothing incoherent about it. So that idea exists. God has a perfect idea of his own essence. And, God is extended. That's one of God's attributes, that's one of God's attributes, extension. Therefore, God has a perfect idea of himself as extended, right? So already then, the parallelism is starting to emerge in Proposition 3. It's stated directly in Proposition 7, but it's emerging here in Proposition 3, right? Because there exists in God a perfect idea of material reality. And then I will also add, since we're talking about the human mind ultimately, that we have some access to that idea. It's limited because we're limited. But, our minds are in God. So our minds are participating in that perfect idea of material reality. We don't have the whole thing, but each of us has some part of it, right? So that gives us some hope that we could come to know material reality, right? That actually gives us a pretty good shot. And so we'll sort of be revolving around this idea, like, okay, material reality is out there, we have some access to it, how much, how does it work? We'll keep refining that picture as we move through part 2. Okay, and also on page 390, we have Proposition 6. So here I'll just paraphrase some ideas from Proposition 6 and the proof. So God is the cause of specific thoughts, but that's when God is considered as thinking. God is the cause of specific bodies, but that's when God is considered as extended, right? In other words, part of what Spinoza seems to be getting at is ideas account for each other, bodies account for each other, God is involved, he orders them, right? But from God's point of view, there is no time. I think I already mentioned that in the first lecture. If not, now you know, right? So God's perspective is that of eternity, and he sees a complex ordering of ideas and bodies, right? And we already know they're running parallel to each other. It's not that he creates one and then creates the other, right? He creates a complex material reality in which the bodies coexist and they determine each other to behave in certain ways. And it's not that he creates this idea and that idea. He creates a full-blown mental universe in which the thoughts determine each other and cohere together in various ways. So God causes everything, but when we say God is the cause of a specific thought, we mean, as being thinking himself, right? As sort of like having that attribute all thinking exists in him. So he's like the ground of being, but then when you look at being, whether in thought or in reality, or physical reality, I should say, you see all these causal connections and all these logical connections, right? And so there is a causal order, whether you're directly taking God into account or not. And then that helps with the parallelism, seems to me, right? There is, again, an inherent order in each realm. It happens to spring from God, who himself is well ordered, right? And so we ought to expect a parallel ordering, right, in either realm. Sorry if that seemed a little redundant. But there we are. So I think we've got the ordering of things down, and then the parallels between the two orders, between the two realms. I think we've got it down. Okay. So moving to Proposition 9 on page 392, right? This sort of amplifies what I was already saying. I hope. I'll read it to you, and we'll discuss. Proposition 9, the idea of a particular thing actually existing is caused by God, not insofar as he is infinite, but insofar as he is considered as affected by another idea of a particular thing actually existing, of which too he is the cause, insofar as he is affected by a third idea, and so on to infinity. So to me, Proposition 6 and Proposition 9 enlighten each other. I hope that's what Spinoza intended, but even if he didn't, it seems we can use them to interpret each other, right? Because what Spinoza seems to be saying here is, look, you have an idea of a particular thing, right? It's caused by God, but how? Is it just his infinity? Is it the direct expression of his infinity? Not insofar as he is infinite. I don't think Spinoza wants to say, well, his infinity isn't responsible. He's more saying, well, let's take a different tack. Let's not interpret it that way. Let's come up with the best interpretation here. I mean, he didn't say no. He said not insofar as, right? The infinity is involved, but here's a more correct way. Hopefully, hopefully that helps. Right, not insofar as this, but that. Right, don't think of his infinity. Think of the fact that this idea of a particular thing existing is caused by another idea of a particular thing existing, right? And you can think of these things as present to God. In some way, it's, that's a little iffy, that's a little tricky, really, from Spinoza's perspective. As long as they're eternally present, I suppose, it's okay. In any case, there is talk about God being affected here. So, in other words, we are to think of God thinking of this specific body, right? And so that gives him one idea, and then that produces another idea that corresponds to this particular body, right? So we've got the correlation or the parallelism going, and at the same time we've got this idea from Proposition 6 that we ought not to think of God as just directly creating this and that willy-nilly, one at a time, right? We ought to understand that each realm, the realm of thought and the realm of body, has an internal coherence and ordering, right? It's not one at a time. It's not willy-nilly. The ideas all determine each other. They're interconnected. The bodies all determine each other. They're interconnected. And then, through God, each idea is of a particular body, right? Because he's the one with the attribute of thought and the attribute of extension, and he's the one that produces the isomorphic ordering. That's not easy to say. You try it. Isomorphic ordering. Well, maybe it's easy for you. I don't know. Okay. So moving on then. At this point forward, we're talking more about the human mind, right? That's what this part 2 is supposed to be about anyway. But I'm just going to note, we've really been talking about a sort of general high-level parallelism. Now we're going to get more into how a specific human mind is supposed to operate. Okay, so Proposition 11, let's read that from page 393. The first element that constitutes the actual being of the human mind is nothing other than the idea of some particular thing actually existing. Pardon me, I needed some water there. Okay. So some idea constitutes the human mind. That is to say, the human mind is this complex idea with a certain time span, right? And something sets it in motion. Ideas start to unfold from an initial idea, right? That's what Spinoza seems to be getting at here. Because that initial idea leads to all these ramifications, leads to all these other ideas, because it's prolific, because it's fruitful, it must be an idea of a real thing. It's hard to make that clear without bringing a bunch of other propositions into it, but let's just say that basically Spinoza's idea of error is based on Descartes' idea of error, right? In order for you to make an error, there's some amount of participation in nothingness, right? It looks different in the details in Spinoza, but that's the basic picture. If you're beholding being, you can't go wrong, right? The way Descartes would put it is, if you're looking at clear and distinct ideas, you can't go wrong. Those basically come directly from God. So for Spinoza, it's more direct. If you're looking at reality, you're looking at God, and you can't go wrong. If the idea is fruitful and actually leads to all these other positive ideas, that's an indication that the initial idea was an idea of a real thing, because, as we said with respect to Descartes earlier in a different lecture, nothing comes from nothing, right? A real thing is needed to beget other real things, right? So the mind is over here begetting all these other ideas. Well, the parallel is whatever body that initial idea is an idea of is also begetting material things, right? They're isomorphic. as we've said, it wouldn't make sense for a non-real thing to beget a bunch of other things. So this idea that initiates the mind, it has to be an idea of a real body, a real particular body that actually exists. Weird, right? I'll just pause and say, wow, that was a weird thing for Spinoza to say. But there it is, okay. But we're also leading on to other things here. So taking, that was Proposition 11. Taking Propositions 12 and 13 together now, perhaps it's not surprising when Spinoza goes on to say, okay, this thing that you had an idea of, that's definitely a real thing, that's the body that goes with that mind. In other words, what the mind has an idea of initially is its body, right? So your mind is an idea of your body, in other words. And how do we know that? Well, that again goes back to the parallelism between mind and body. So the body is begetting all these bodily things, like the physical correlates of specific passions, like love and envy, but also hunger and thirst, appetites then, if you like. The body is having all the physical correlates of specific perceptions, right? So whatever is going on here, whatever realm the mind exists in, maybe it's not a spatial realm, doesn't really matter. It's an idea of a body. There are all these things happening in that body that this complex idea has specific ideas of. So this idea is correlated with this body, and so this is its body. So if this is my mind, sorry, I'm getting weird here. I'm getting punchy. If this is my mind, and it's an idea of this body, then this has to be my body. Because there are physical correlates of my perceptions and my appetites and my passions going on here, right? Because of the isomorphism. So there we go. Now we're getting a more definite idea about how mind and body go together. They don't even have to have a physical connection in the pineal gland or whatever. It's just that you have this single idea that constitutes you, and it's an idea of a body, and so that idea is complex, and it's made up of complex parts that are isomorphic with complex things going on in that body. So that's your body, right? And the isomorphism is happening because things unfold in the two realms according to a similar ordering coming from God. Oh, Spinoza, you're such an odd one. Okay, so let's sum up some things. So after Proposition 13, we get a lesson in physics about how bodies move in space, in other words. And remember, this part is about the human mind. Part 2 is about the human mind. So what is the point of this little interlude? Spinoza's really telling us what makes a body, right? So a body can consist of lots of different complex parts, but basically what makes it a single body is what you would expect. The parts are integrated in such a way that they move together through space. And so if you grab a part of the body, right, and you have enough strength, you can use that part, that perch that you have on the body, to move the whole body, right? I mean, that's kind of what this lesson on physics amounts to, right? So if your mind is attached to that body that's being moved, then of course the body is having, kinesthetic sensations, or the physical correlates of those. So you'll have an experience of that body being moved. Okay, and we get some biology. So there's a physics lesson, there's a biology lesson. Basically, the biology lesson tells us how perception is possible, and it's very abstract. It's not about how specific organs work or something like that. It's just a general picture. There are fluid parts of the body. Don't take that to mean liquid. It's just some parts of the body are easily impressed upon, so fluid at least, more so than others, right? Like your eyeball. An impression can be made upon your eyeball. Because these parts are fluid, they can retain impressions made by outside objects, right? And so you're able to perceive because you're able to receive images of bodies, and that begins to explain memory as well, along with some other things, right? That impression could be retained, right? Or it could go away and then you could bring it back through your own initiative, right? Or, like I said, this starts to explain other things. You could have a hallucination because that impression could get there without the corresponding thing being out there, right? You could have an impression as of an angry dog, but there's no angry dog there, because after all that's going on is the fluid parts are in a particular physical configuration. So that configuration can be that configuration can be caused in the usual way by an actual angry dog, or it could be caused in a deviant way, maybe because you have a really high fever, and so your body is just randomly moving through impression after impression because your body's disordered, right? That's the same general picture that we see in Descartes. He went over some of that stuff in Meditation 6. You might recall, human bodies are particularly complex, and so they're capable of receiving very complex impressions. He's basically trying to explain human intelligence, and Spinoza is saying that it depends on the body and the body's configuration. He's not shying away from that conclusion. So he would have to think, he has to be some kind of panpsychic, right? Panpsychism is the view that the whole world is sentient, right? If there's a parallel between the order of ideas and the order of material things, then everything has an idea associated with it. It seems that we can have specific perceptions because of the complexities of our bodies, right? And so we can retain these very complex impressions in our fluid parts. But one gets the impression from the big picture here that, all of being can perceive. All of being certainly has ideas associated with it, right? But we humans can perceive specific states of affairs and other complex things because of our bodily complexity. So that's a much more nuanced view than we saw in Descartes. Spinoza, even if he doesn't have the mind and body interacting directly, and maybe he doesn't, he's taking the body very seriously, right, as a substrate for the mind, or however you want to put that. Right, substrate makes it sound like, the mind is primary, but really they're just two parallel realms for him, and he's taking them both seriously, let's say. Okay, page 397, according to Proposition 16, we are subject to confused ideas, confused in the same sense that Descartes talked about confused ideas. You remember you remember Descartes' discussion of confused ideas? Right. I mean, the sensory ideas in particular are confused because there's a conceptual part and there's a sensory part, so the body gets mixed in with intellectual concepts, and that's how you end up with confused ideas. So Spinoza has a similar view, not surprisingly. Your ideas of external things are mixed up with your ideas of your own body. And that follows from the physical picture here. The only way for you to get ideas of external things is for impressions to be made on your body. Right? So naturally, the impression that is made, it partly depends on the external thing making the impression, but it partly depends on your own body and the impressions that can be made on it. Right? There has to be an interaction. So you get these confused ideas that tell you something about external stuff, but they're also telling you partly about the constitution of your own body, right? And that should make sense, right? We're familiar with that from the meditations, right? And then, just like in Descartes, there's a tenuous connection to reality, as I already mentioned, because you could have the impression without the thing actually being there, right? And again, parallel to Descartes, I'm sorry, this is a bit redundant, but I think it might be good to sum up the parallels. As long as you pay attention to what's really there and present in the impression, and don't infer too much from it, right? Then you'll be okay, right? I mean, Descartes and Spinoza both believe that you have some connection to being. You have to understand what your limits are, right? You have to understand what you can know and you can't know. If you keep that in mind, you won't misconstrue the evidence. You won't misconstrue your own sensory impressions and make more of them than you should. Furthermore, getting to page 400 here, if you look at propositions 23 and 24, Spinoza says, the mind only knows itself through its ideas of the modifications of its body. So the mind doesn't know itself very well either, right? Not if it takes this route anyway. So we'll say more about route in a minute. But the mind knows the body through impressions made on it by other bodies, and otherwise it doesn't really have ideas work with, right? Not that Spinoza says, right? He seems to be saying all ideas have material correlates. So this is different from Descartes, right? So Spinoza may not be a rationalist to the same degree as Descartes. The mind can know itself on the basis of the impressions that are made on its body, right? And so it can get to know itself sort of indirectly that way. So it doesn't have the kind of adequate knowledge of itself that Descartes thought that it had, right? And that would seem to be because Spinoza's tying the mind more to the body than Descartes did, right? So that's interesting. I mean, I don't know where Spinoza rejects. I think, therefore, I am. Maybe he doesn't reject it. Maybe he just thinks it's not informative. But he doesn't comment on it explicitly. So that's interesting. He's not taking his rationalism as far as Descartes does. So the mind is not transparent to itself. The mind is a bit of a stranger to itself, actually. Okay, so we'll leave it at that. But there's a consolation, right? So the mind doesn't know itself as well as Descartes thought, but here's a consolation on page 402, proposition 32. Why don't I read it? All ideas are true insofar as they relate to God, and that was short, so I'll go ahead and read the proof. All ideas that are in God agree in every respect with their metaphysical and epistemic objects, therefore they are all true. So, so what does that mean? Okay. So if you're trying to understand things by taking the empirical route, in other words, using your sensory impressions to reconstruct an image of the material world, that will always be inadequate, necessarily so. You just don't have enough of the world in view to get a good, adequate picture of it. So you can have helpful, beneficial knowledge that way. Now this is in parallel with Descartes' view, right? So using confused ideas, you can build up an image of the world, and that can help you survive in the world, and that's great. But none of that knowledge is adequate. How do you get adequate knowledge? By relating your ideas to God. Basically, that seems to be what Proposition 32 is telling us. In other words, you think about the things you're familiar in the world, you can think about what caused them and what caused the causes and what caused the causes of the causes, and you're just going to end up with a murky mess. Some of that knowledge, again, might be useful, but it's a murky mess. You'll never get to the end of it. Or you can understand that all material things participate in extension. They're part of being, and they have the attribute of extension. And of course, they correspond with the ideas in us. We have ideas of those objects, and those ideas participate in being as well. And that's under the attribute of thought. And that knowledge, though not useful, Spinoza's kind of admitting that philosophy isn't full of useful knowledge here. That knowledge is perfect. That knowledge is adequate. There's nothing wrong with it, and there's nothing missing. Right? So that's a consolation. There is some good, perfect knowledge out there, right? Even if we don't get to know what we hoped to know. I would say that the points I'm making about Proposition 32 are bolstered by Proposition 38, which says, that which is common to all things and is equally and apart and in the whole cannot be conceived except adequately. So that alludes to extension and thought, right? Extension is in the part and in the whole, because there's a whole realm of extension, and each extended thing participates in it, and there's a whole realm of thought, and each idea participates in it. And those things that are common can be conceived adequately, and that's because if you think of a specific extended thing, extension is there, and you can fully grasp it on the basis of the extended thing. And if you think of an idea, the attribute of thought is there, right? You can think of thought adequately by looking at a specific thought. So that's a bit Cartesian, right? At least I am, I exist is a specific thought, right? And you can understand thinking by looking at that thought. Okay, so let's try to wrap this up here. So knowledge of specific external things is grounded in the finite perspective of the body. So we can't have full knowledge of the world going through the routes. I said I'd say more about routes. Going through the route of perception, basically, right? But when we consider God under the two known attributes, thought and extension, we can have a full top-down understanding of ourselves. So I suppose we could call the one lateral understanding. Lateral understanding is necessarily inadequate. Lateral meaning side by side. I'm next to these other objects, and I try to think about them, and I try to grasp their connections to the objects next to them, and it gets away from me. So lateral understanding, inadequate. Top-down understanding, adequate, but admittedly not as useful. And then finally, to completely wrap it up, there are some thoughts on death here, right? So my understanding tells me that I will die, right? And that even comes from the top down, right? To some extent, I understand adequately that finite things are finite and that they come into being and pass away. And I'm one of those finite things. I have a top-down understanding that I'm mortal, that I must die. It is necessary, right? But I can't know when, right? Because the duration of a specific finite thing depends on what's going on with the things around it. So that's lateral understanding. If I want to understand how long a specific finite thing will last, that's lateral understanding. And I'm not going to get to the bottom of it, right? So that has implications for what comes next. I've already said this really is a book on ethics. There's some really heavy metaphysics, but going forward, Spinoza is going to tell us, among other things, how to deal with mortality, how to deal with the fact that we're going to die, right? So there are two things we know here about death. Definitely we will die. We have a top-down understanding of that. Definitely we don't know when, because now we have a top-down understanding that tells us that our lateral understanding of when we're going to die will never be adequate, right? So knowing that you're going to die and not being able to know when, that's just a difficult part of the human condition, and Spinoza wants to help us deal with that. Okay, so that's what we need from part 2. At least this was shorter than the first lecture. Thanks for bearing with me. Bye.